It's been a few weeks since my last episode, and today is the last day of November, so we have a whole month to cover. Get ready. Actually, yeah, I mean, there's so much I want to say about the last month, but I have to condense my material and focus on the local. But first off, I want to talk about, the future of this podcast. I mean, I don't know how frequently I'm going to do this because, it requires a lot of material to come up with a decent episode that people are going to listen to. But thankfully, we have the LNP, which is the gift that keeps on giving. No, actually, it's pretty predictable, the behavior of it. And it's kind of funny with the news cycle. The political news cycle kind of ebbs and flows. Like, there's always this attention to certain issues, like the so-called culture wars were big in the last few months leading up to this past November's election, where we had arguments about, transgender ideology in schools, and we had a school board race, and, the book content was a big issue too. Those are the two main things I would say. And now, well, what happened? Let's talk about the election results. At least in Manheim Township, all 5 of the Republican candidates lost, and they were people that I supported, and I supported their message. We can disagree. We can speculate on whether the strategy was a winning one or not, but I supported what they stood for, as I've discussed on my podcast in previous episodes. But I've said this before. I would have preferred they had talked more about medical freedom than the stuff about book content and, the protecting girls' sports. Because, well, if you look at it, 2021, I mean, that was a good year for Republican school boards, but let's think about it. It was kind of an anomaly. Well, before I get to that point, I just need to point out the voter registration for Republicans has been improving statewide. From 2012 to 2022, the voters identifying as Republican went from 35% to 40%, whereas for voters identifying as Democrats, it went down from 45% to 37%. Now, Lancaster County is one of only 6 counties where it has actually been trending left over roughly the same period of time. Now, there's a number of reasons you could speculate about that. The demographics, the people who are moving in. I think Gen Z has a lot to do with it, and some of the indoctrination that's going on in colleges, and the kids come home from college and then all of a sudden they're Democrats. But that's a whole topic for another episode. But my point about 2021 was that 2021 was an anomaly in the Republicans' favor because COVID policies were so terrible. They affected everyone, and thus there was no propagandizing around it. I think few parents would have been happy to continue sending their kids to school having to wear useless masks all day, or have them shut down in-person learning altogether again, no matter how the newspaper spun it. But with 2023, the Republicans had a harder sell for school board because book content didn't affect every kid, nor were, to be honest, were girls' sports really affected? In Manheim Township, at least not yet. Now, don't get me wrong, I supported everything the Republican candidates stood for on the school board. But, I mean, this is why I mentioned that I would like for them to still talk about medical freedom / pandemic response freedom, because this is something I knew that the LNP and the Democrats would be able to win their propaganda war on the transgender and book content issues and make it about inclusivity, quote unquote, because it's harder for everyone to see the immediate effects of this indoctrination if your own kids aren't directly affected. I mean, how many kids actually spend time in the library and go looking for the books that were being pointed out? And how many kids were really being asked, how many males were asking to join a girls' team? So, you have people reading the LNP and they look at their own kid's situation, and of course they're going to think, well, this whole issue is manufactured, and the newspaper must be right about extremist or far right. So I don't know. I think, yeah, LNP helped the Democrats with this, and maybe, who knows, maybe the outcome would have been different if LNP had actually published, some of the content that's in those books that parents were concerned about. But no, it's just all left to the imagination and taking their word for it. But speaking of manufactured issues, I mean, they're the ones who are keeping this thing going. The latest crusade that Brett Schultes is on about is regarding the Scholastic books. If you look at the November 19th article, it's titled "Far Right Goes After Book Fairs." Again, the boogeyman far right is coming for your books. And so it's so funny how they do this. That was a piece on Sunday, the 19th. Then on the 26th, they have their "In Our Own Words" piece in the perspective section. And again, they quote their own guy. They lead off that section. "If activist groups from the religious right have their way, Scholastic book fairs in Lancaster County and beyond, blah, blah, blah." And it's verbatim a quote from the previous week's Schultes article. So it goes on to say how the Scholastic book fairs may be replaced by Sky Tree book fairs that distribute quote-unquote pro-God, pro-America children's books. And again, it's all about the boogeyman Christian nationalists who are coming for your books. I mean, does that seem like a likely possibility in a purple county like Lancaster County that's, trending to the left and, made a clean sweep, at least in some of the school districts like Manheim Township? Yeah, sorry, I'm just not buying it. I want to take a step back. There's a great Facebook post circulating right now. It's from a guy named Luis Antonio Vidal Butler, and it kind of speaks to some of these culture topics that have affected school board races in other areas. It says, "Our generation was tolerant and we didn't know it. Now they have invented so many genders that somehow provoke the opposite of acceptance. I'm from the generation that listened to and loved David Bowie and Lou Reed, and we never had a problem with their sexual preferences. We didn't care at all. We were actually very happy with them. Elton John, Freddie Mercury, George Michael. We were also the generation that loved Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, Neil Young, the Eagles, without questioning the content that today would be considered sexist. When Boy George arrived, we didn't wonder if he liked men or women or both. We just enjoyed his music. And when Jimmy Somerville told us his story about when he was a country boy, we moved in and sang with him. And there were no laws that required us to stand in solidarity or at least participate. We just enjoyed their art and how magnificent they were and will be. There were no threatening commissions or careful guards who would censor us if a prank came out. I'd like to understand what happened in the meantime, because all these censors have the sole effect of creating what they censor. In my opinion, we were going further without imposition, because impositions, often lead to the opposite effect. I saw it on social networks, and I totally agree. Woke culture is a nonsense. They only pretend to confront us, defend causes that are overcome with the sole purpose of polarizing the population, so that we do not go after the guilty, the few oligarchs who dominate the world to their convenience and whimsy." The translation from Spanish to English is a little off, but yeah, I mean, I love that last sentence, which to me kind of summarizes what's going on here. It's a wielding of power by the oligarchs to divide us and control us. I touch on that a little bit in my... I'm going to do a series of plugs here in the last half of this episode. I wrote an article a little over a month ago. It was printed in the Lancaster Patriot called Of Statism and Post-Christianity. Check it out if you get a chance. Now, I do want to point out an interesting parallel that occurred to me. I was reading this letter to the editor, I think it was this past Sunday, and the last sentence said, "I believe that government officials of both parties must leave the topic of sex education to those who have the experience and training, teachers, counselors, and school librarians with the support of parents and trained clergy." So again, this letter was kind of pushing back against conservative parents, and it's saying, basically it's the trust the experts argument, which, as I mentioned in the last podcast episode, it really means trust the state-sanctioned experts, which if you can read about in my article that I just pointed out, it's not always a good idea because they can be quite corrupt and self-serving. But my point in reading this little passage, the trust the experts, it's the same thing that so-called, progressives or liberals, whatever you want to call them, they're taking that line of argument with in terms of school books and the whole, transgender and the modern medicine. It's all tied together because that's exactly the mindset during COVID 2 years ago. Trust the experts. It's interesting. I was at the doctor last week, and it's just wild how much has changed. Like, there's no masks required now. And I actually went in because I had a respiratory ailment. It was, I just had a cough. I felt fine, but I had a lingering cough, so I went to get checked out. And they didn't even test me for anything. And, after the doctor examined me, I asked him, well, can I go away and see my elderly relatives over Thanksgiving? Am I contagious? And he said, no, don't worry about it. You're not contagious. The idea that they would have let me go out of there, what has changed about the science so much? Like, isn't COVID still around? The difference now is, like, if you tell them you're asymptomatic, you feel fine other than this cough, they take your word for it and you're not contagious. And also, there's no pressure to get these vaccines. Actually, the nurse assistant before the doctor came and saw me was almost apologetic. She's like, I see you didn't get your flu shots, you didn't get your COVID shots, and are you interested? And I said, no. And she said, oh, that's okay. I'll take it off of here so it doesn't show up in your charts anymore. So, that's quite a turnaround from the last time I had a checkup 2 years ago, and the doctor was giving me a hard time. So just tying this back to the whole school board race, the Republican candidates may have lost, and I don't know if it would have made a difference if they had campaigned on this, but they were still in the right on COVID, and they still are. Now, I'm going to wrap up here, and I want to end with a plug. Well, I'm not going to end just yet, but I'm excited for a couple of guests that I think I'm going to be able to line up in the future who I've met through my Toastmasters class. Well, what is Toastmasters? It's a public speaking practice forum. You can meet other professionals or non-professionals, and just if you need practice with your public speaking, come on out. I'm the president of Red Rose Toastmasters. We meet downtown in Lancaster City twice a month for an hour, and it's a lot of fun. And I've gained a lot for over the last 2 years as a member. But anyway, my fellow Toastmaster Jim is going to speak with me about, he's a constitutional scholar, so I hope to have him on soon. The Bill of Rights Day is coming up on December 15th, and he wants to talk all about that. I also have another fellow Toastmaster who is an expert on hypnotism, and she gave this great speech the other day, and I was really interested, and I said, hey, do you follow Scott Adams? And, do you follow the news? And because I'm a big critic of the news, and I feel like they hypnotize the masses. And she was all in. She's like, yeah, that's half the reason I got into this field. So I'm hoping to have her on my show soon. And one of the other things about Toastmasters, you can choose your own speech topics. And recently I gave a speech about the Defend the Guard bill, which I hope to do a whole show on soon. It's a very important state level piece of legislation that's been introduced in many different states, and we're hoping to get that done here in PA. Check out defendtheguard.us if you're interested. Lastly, I want to plug my friend's podcast, Crotocast. I was actually a guest on very recently. It's available on Spotify, and you can also find it on YouTube. That's Crotocast, C-R-O-T-O cast. And I talked about some of the same stuff I've talked about in my last couple of shows. And they're part of a community called 1212 Studios, based off of 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 12, which talks about how one body has many parts. So the idea here is we're going to be a community of podcasters on different topics. And my podcast is going to be part of this community too. So I might actually stay tuned. I might have a new URL for my podcast if you subscribe to me. I don't know what it is yet, but I'm hoping I can keep the name Lancast. Anyway, that's a wrap for my show today, and I will talk with y'all soon. Be well.